Welcome to episode 62 of the Filmumentaries podcast. Thanks for joining me again. This is Jamie Benning here. If you're new to the podcast, you can check back over 61 episodes in which I talk to all sorts of behind-the-scenes crew members, from stuntmen and puppeteers to VFX artists and directors. If you follow me on Twitter at JamieSWB or on Instagram at Filmumentaries, or indeed if you're part of the Filmumentaries group on Facebook, you'll have seen that I'm about to launch, along with my buddy Patrick, a Kickstarter for our first feature documentary. Right now you can register your interest to be informed about the launch, which, all being well, will be on Friday the 18th of November. I'll leave a link in the show notes, or you can check out my pinned tweet to see the details there. The documentary itself is about the life and career of production designer Joe Alves, who I interviewed back in episode 19 of this podcast. So you can check that out if you'd like. Joe worked in the industry for 4 decades, designing for Walt Disney, Alfred Hitchcock, Steven Spielberg and John Carpenter, to name but a few. Joe is quite unique, though, in that he kept so much of the production material that he created, like blueprints, storyboards, sketches, Polaroids, so much stuff. And, you know, Joe worked on Sugarland Express. He worked for Alfred Hitchcock while he was at Universal TV. He worked on the Indy 500, creating designs for their graphics the first time it was shown on TV. He drew some animations for Sleeping Beauty. He animated the id in Forbidden Planet. He was the production designer on Jaws, Close Encounters, Escape from New York. I mean, the list just goes on, and his archive is incredible, and we have full access to him and it. Patrick and I spent a week with Joe at his home in California earlier in the year. We got hours and hours of interview and B-roll with Joe and his archive, and now we need a budget to finish it. We've already had some producers interested in helping us sell it, but we need to get it to a rough cut first. So we're looking for £80,000, which sounds like a lot. Sounds like a lot to me. But if you know anything about film production, that kind of money doesn't last very long. In fact, you might expect to spend far more than that just on post-production. So we think that's kind of a realistic amount that's going to enable us to get the project finished to a point where we can sell it. So we need your support via Kickstarter so that we can go out to LA again, do some secondary follow-up interviews with Joe, and also speak with his collaborators. We're aiming high. We'd like to speak to John Carpenter and Steven Spielberg, but we're also hoping to talk with admirers of Joe's work, people that were inspired by his work, and we are finding that doors are beginning to open just because of how much people love Joe. You'll see from our Kickstarter trailer on the 18th just how charming Joe is. Patrick and I just kind of fell in love with him and his family and his house, and yeah, he's just a wonderful guy to be around, and it's just going to make such an interesting documentary. He rubbed shoulders with just about everybody in Hollywood. I'm talking Elvis Presley, Paul Newman. He worked on a Marilyn Monroe film. He worked on Sleeping Beauty. I mean, these films that he worked on, they just cross 4 decades of Hollywood, and yeah, amazing. He would drop another name while we were talking to him. We'd be like, Joe, how come you've not mentioned this up until now? So we know you're going to love this documentary. You'll be able to choose on Kickstarter from a number of tiers, from £10 to £5,000. Yep, we're catering for everybody here, with a choice of some amazing merch, including an exclusive Blu-ray with extras, an amazing poster which is being specifically created for this project. You could have your name in the credits, you could have an exec producer credit, and there's even the chance for a full corporate package with your company's logo at the start of the film, your name at the start of the film. So have a look on Kickstarter for Not Your Average Joe, which is the title of the documentary. And if you can help us, that would be fantastic. If you can't help us in that way, then please just retweet like crazy next week, share with your friends, and even invite us on your podcast to talk about it. It'd be great to kind of tell you more about our adventure so far with this. We've been keeping it quiet, and we've been absolutely raring to tell everybody because we know it's just going to be fantastic. And yeah, we can't wait to get some support and get our teeth back into the project and get it finished. Okay, back to the business of this episode. If you listened to episode 61, you know it was part 1 of a 2-part conversation with Lucasfilm and ILM producer Jim Bloom. Now, Jim is a great talker and worked on so many projects, most of them successful, but he also talks openly and enthusiastically about some movies that didn't make it into production and about some that did but didn't do much at the box office. And there's always stories behind these, and I think you're going to find them as fascinating as I did. In this conversation, we do talk about his cameos as Luke Skywalker in The Empire Strikes Back and how that came about. Also about the challenges of running an effects house and the ups and downs of life as a producer. His views on Return of the Jedi director, the late Richard Marquand, and his time working alongside Richard in Yuma and in the Redwood Forests in California. We also talk about a little-known film that Jim produced called Warning Sign, released in 1983, which he says had some hints towards how a future pandemic may play out. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm definitely going to track it down on DVD or Blu-ray or VHS or somewhere. It sounds quite intriguing. So here's part 2 of my conversation with producer Jim Bloom, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So Jim, tell me about that experience of, having to move Industrial Light and Magic to Northern California. What did it entail? What were the kind of challenges? And was there any resistance to it?
No, there was no resistance to it. Everybody was quite happy, and they really didn't have a choice because that was what we were doing. It was we were moving ILM that belonged to Lucasfilm, out of Van Nuys, California, and we were really starting from scratch because everything that was down in Van Nuys, except for a few pieces here and there, belonged to what then became Dykstra's company, Apogee. And we were moving into a shell of a building, and that was really sort of one of the first things was to create an empty warehouse on Kerner Boulevard. I forget how many square feet it was. I think, probably close to, my guess would be 10,000 would be my guess. And it wasn't really enough room. But the plan was to sort of go in and put some offices in and design a visual effects facility, which, this is sort of new stuff that hadn't been really done before because we were designing all these different apartments and every department had their own prerequisites. And we had to really the first challenge was to go in and hire the key people in each of the departments that we were putting together, and then begin to staff the thing. And then once hiring them, convince people, would you like to move up to the Bay Area? Because a lot of folks were leaving Los Angeles. Initially the most important people were to hire were Joe Johnston and Richard Edlund and Dennis Murin and Lauren Peterson and Steve Gawley, and to put those initial departments together. The way you would launch any movie, you sort of start creatively and then you kind of branch out from there as you need your other departments, and you need your effects supervisors right away to help you staff and build a place. And a lot of the concerns that people had was that, will there be a facility here beyond Empire? And one of the selling points was that yes, there would be, because the goal was not to make a sequel, but to make 11 sequels, because that was the plan. And I used to have conversations with George about that when we were first starting, which was, okay, what are we doing? Well, we're doing the first trilogy, and then we're doing, we're doing the middle trilogy, and then we're going to go back and do the first trilogy, and then we're going to go do the last trilogy, which was sort of done. And then after that, there were going to be 3 separate stories, and the 3 separate stories were going to be, as I recall, and I'm probably forgetting one now, but we were going to do, a Wookiee story, and we were going to do a droid story, and then there was going to be a 3rd story. I don't know if I don't think they ever really did a Wookiee story, but they went to a Wookiee planet on one of the, prequels, or I forget. I remember in some movies seeing hundreds of Wookiees running around. And so that was the goal, was to let these folks know that when they were coming, they weren't just coming for 2 or 3 years, because I guess the visual effects industry back in the early 1980s, even into the early 2000s, it was a very young industry, and there were a lot of people who knew about it, knew how to, there were some great old timers, who were mostly optical printer experts and matte painters and whatnot. But the difficulty and the key was to put a group of people together who were, good people, nice people, people who cared about it, people who had worked on the first Star Wars, who had maybe worked at other movies like Close Encounters, for example, like Dennis had. No, I mean, he and I didn't know that until years later that we had both worked on Close Encounters, but he was working with Doug Trumbull, and I was mostly working on the set. And so the initial hard part is, okay, let's build this place out, and at the same time, let's make a movie and let's build it out. So it would not only be for one movie, but it would also be as an ongoing facility. So from a producing business point of view, one of the wasn't a difficulty, but it was always something I had to keep in my mind from an expense point of view was that, okay, is this for the movie or is this for the facility? And to somehow try to keep some sort of sense of separating, keeping those costs somewhat separate from an accounting perspective and whatnot. And I mean, it wasn't hard because we were making a sequel to Star Wars, and it's like, well, it's like me, who else, who didn't want to come work on The Empire Strikes Back, who didn't, not want to, make this movie better than the first one, and then look at the people that we were putting together to work with. It was really such a great group of people. And then the other person who also came on as a supervisor was Brian Johnson, who, as mostly a live action effects supervisor, also had a background in visual effects and doing some of that work and coordinating, his efforts in with Richard and Dennis. Although Brian was mostly going to be off with the live action unit, as opposed to with the post production unit. Except that when we finished live action, he came back and and integrated himself into what was happening at ILM in San Rafael.
And
So
what challenges did that distance between shooting at Elstree and having a effects facility in Northern California present?
it just difficulties of being in a faraway location, and everything that was happening in the UK was, it's like you and I talking right now. I mean, here I am at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in California, and you're ready to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night in London. So the problems really had more to do with that. When London went to work in the morning, it was midnight. And so there were times that I would get phone calls at 11 or 12 at night about something, before I went to sleep, that I had to deal with first thing the next morning. But we always tried to stay ahead. And what was interesting back then is, there were no cell phones, there were no emails. Everything was done via telephone or via telex machine. And the telex was really interesting. The telex was sort of like, it was like an email machine where there was a unit in San Rafael and there was a unit in London. And so, at the end of each day, if there's something I had to communicate to London, we would type, what was a written email out on this typewriter. And then we'd have a hard copy, and then they would get a copy that was typed out to them, hard copy, that they would see the first thing the next morning. And the same thing was true to us, as during their day there. The first thing that I would do when I came in the morning is that, we would check the telex machine to see what had been communicated from London, because that was, I mean, now it's kind of a joke to think about it, but that was the instant communication that we had between both offices if we weren't actually talking on the telephone.
And so you were often working with text descriptions of what had happened in that day's shoot, and then I'm guessing you wouldn't see effects plates or dailies for quite some time after that.
Correct. Yeah, it would take a long time, and oftentimes, a lot of the if stuff was important, we would try and get it over right away. So, for example, I was in Norway during the second unit because somebody, that was what Gary and George wanted me to be there, because I, shared this unique understanding of not only live action, but what I had learned on visual effects from having worked on a few movies and now having worked, for over a year on Empire before we started shooting. And so they wanted a responsible production person there. And the essence of the production crew per se was, there was, George, who was the executive producer, but there was Gary, Robert, and me. That was the team. I was the US guy, and Robert was the UK guy, and Gary was the Uber producer. And it was really just the three of us running, that from an organizational chart point of view, the whole production. And underneath Robert was all of the live action that was happening in Elstree and indirectly production crew wise of stuff in Norway. And for me, it was anything that happened in the United States, from visual effects to post production to editorial, all of those kind of things. And so anyway, they wanted me in Norway because I kind of understood what we needed. I knew what ILM needed. I mean, that's why I think in a previous conversation, I joked with you that Peter McDonald, who was the second unit director, and I used to argue about stuff, because I always had to say to Peter, Peter, really what's important here, I know the soldiers are retreating and escaping, but we have to make sure that there are explosions in the ground that are coming from the snow walkers that you're seeing in the background, although we're not seeing them. And we have to like frame our, compose our plate shot so we can fit the snow walkers in and see them approaching and see them crossing and things of that nature. And so those plates are really critical. And the other thing that I also knew was really very important in the opening sequences and the battle sequence were the snow speeders, because I knew how wonderful these snow speeders were, because I was, got very close to Ralph McQuarrie and was very close to Joe Johnston when we were designing all the storyboards and doing all of that pre-production work, to know how these sequences were going to get put together, and how all these flying snow speeders and flying around the snow walkers are in the very opening sequence. Because I think Empire sort of opens flying over, flying over that terrain. And I knew that on a big screen shot and, projected in 70 millimeter in a few theaters, this flying stuff with the Westcam camera system with a 65 millimeter camera embedded in the gyroscopically stabilized bubble, how amazing it was going to be. And I knew what a good helicopter pilot Mark Wolf was, and Ron Goodman and Ron's assistant, what a great job that they were going to do, because they used to go out when we had the weather to do it. The weather was another joke. Just how, because they would bring back video stuff, and I would look at it and I would go, even though I was like looking on a small screen because it was video replay, beta tape or whatever. I just knew how exciting it was going to be, and because I knew how beautiful Finse was when the sun was out, just this remarkable undulating glacial landscape. It was really a fantastic location. We had gone scouting there. I think I'd been up to Finse once or twice before we went up to shoot, when we did these, production scouts, when we took Kirsch up there, and, Norman Reynolds was up there, and we would meet the Norwegian crew and, all of those folks. And it was just a great experience. Empire was, it's really one of my favorite movies.
Oh, it holds up so well.
All sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
It was also, when the weather was good, it was a beautiful location. It was just great.
How early was the idea to shoot in a studio dismissed in favor of going on location? Was that something that was made quite quickly?
Well, yes, from the very beginning. It was always, the mandate was, let's go find, no trees, no vegetation, snow and rocks. And Robert had worked on Scott of the Antarctic, BBC documentary in Finse. And so he knew that this location would probably be perfect. And, it was something that was discussed early on, and then eventually the location was chosen.
And what were the circumstances that led to you being in one of the rebel soldiers' costumes?
We needed extras. It was one of the big battle scenes, and it was like all hands on deck. So that's how it happened. It's like, pitch in. It's always a pleasure. And, they didn't necessarily need me behind the camera. I was of more value to the production value of the picture to put an outfit on and get dressed up and get out there and pretend like I was a rebel.
And then you would have had Peter shouting at you at that point, telling you what to do, I guess.
No, we got Peter and I got along. We got along very well. It wasn't, really wasn't problematic. But Peter's a great professional, who had my utmost respect, considering all of the movies and directors that he had worked with, and he came into second unit directing by being a camera operator and a cameraman, and had worked with David Lean and all of these great directors. You can just imagine all the stuff that he had been exposed to in his career, working from such great people.
Yeah, I interviewed him for this podcast. He told me some great stories, some of
About
which I couldn't put in the
Empire.
podcast,
Oh, you couldn't? Why?
I,
You have to tell me later when we're done
yeah,
talking.
yeah, for legal
I'd love to
reasons,
hear
let's
them.
say, yeah,
Huh?
for
But
legal reasons, yeah,
I'd love to hear what they were.
yeah.
That would be fun to
Um,
hear. I'm glad he's still alive. That's wonderful. He must be in his 80s now or something.
yeah, and he's still traveling, still talking about his craft
Really?
and his
That's
job, and
great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. His partner is Madeline Most, who was a second camera assistant, I think she was on Star Wars and Empire, I think.
Really? Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
No.
Yeah, I interviewed her as well. Yeah,
Oh,
she's a force of nature. She sort of
oh, really?
keeps Peter in check. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Um, and then off the back, I heard those stories of coming towards the end of post production on The Empire Strikes Back, where it was decided that the extra shots were needed at the
Right,
very end of The Empire Strikes Back with the medical frigate and the main protagonists in there leaving for, I think, Lando and Chewie leaving for Tatooine. Do you
right.
remember the circumstances that surrounded that as to why they suddenly felt they needed additional effects for the end
You
of the
know,
movie?
I don't No, I mean, we always needed to pick up extra shots all the time. I'd need to have my memory refreshed about that. It's not uncommon in any movie that you start doing cuts and you start screening the picture, and all of a sudden it's like, well, this isn't working. I mean, I could hear George saying, "Ah, this isn't working." It's like, let's figure this one out. What are we going to do here? And then you come up with things to do and things to reshoot or pieces to add or dialogue to add. I mean, I don't in particular remember reshooting anything with Lando or Chewie per se.
I think it was more the effect shots at the end that surround
Yeah,
that scene. Yeah, but yeah,
yeah.
I have to
But
jog my own
I mean,
memory.
to me, that would have just been, oh, okay, fine.
There's more to
We need,
do.
yeah, we've got a few more cuts we need to add.
Sure. Yeah.
To the end of the movie. That kind of thing. I do remember that, maybe there was some pullback that we did, of them in the window as it's leaving.
Yes.
That was okay. Well, how are we going to do this and make that work? And that was, something new and different that hadn't been done before. And I remember, Dennis and Richard, like rolling their eyes and going, "Oh, let's figure this out." Which they always did. I mean, that's the sort of the charm and beauty of working with George is that he gives you a problem and he says, "Well, think about it." Which is
Yeah.
his way of saying, "Let's figure it out. How can we make it work?"
Mm.
Which was always the thing to do.
Yeah. I'm going to be talking to Dennis soon,
Oh, great,
and I will be
great.
talking to him about that opening shot of the Tauntaun on Hoth, and how he just managed to get that stop motion to stick to the ground. I mean, it's insane that shot exists.
Well, Phil,
Yeah.
Phil is really the guy.
Yeah.
You should reach out after you talk to Dennis. You should call Phil.
Yeah. I've been trying to get Phil. We'll see.
No?
We'll see if I
Yeah,
manage to
he
get him.
hasn't come on yet.
Not
No.
yet. Not yet. I'll
Okay.
keep trying. So by this time as well, by the time Empire's done, ILM has gone from this small effects house based in Van Nuys, moving up to Northern California, is now this kind of powerhouse. Everybody wants a piece of ILM, and you are getting commissions thrown at you from multiple different directors and studios. What kind
You
of
know,
press?
I don't think that really happened quite right
Not that
away.
early, right?
No, it didn't quite happen that early because I think that it was still kind of young and new, and a lot of the filmmakers after Star Wars they wanted to do stuff, but I remember the next two movies that ILM went to work on right away were Dragon Slayer and Indiana Jones. And Indiana
Temple of
Jones
Doom at that time, or Raiders was it?
would have been Raiders was the
Raiders, yeah.
first one.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
and
81, yeah.
so really the idea behind ILM was to create a facility that George could use for his movies, essentially for all the Star Wars movies, but you needed to do something in between to keep the facility going and keep the people there and hired and working. And this is quite in those kind of operations, you become very um, cost-wise labor intensive. the equipment and stuff was also expensive compared to general movie stuff because we were building a lot of things that had never been built before. We built new 65 millimeter cameras, specifically for Empire, some of which never worked or did work, but didn't work right away. But, we kind of, I mean, for example, we built this camera called the Empire Flex that we brought to Norway with us because it was an easier, smaller, lighter weight camera as opposed to the old, remodeled VistaVision 3-stripe Technicolor camera, which was the workhorse, which always worked. It worked when you needed it, and that's what a lot of the plate work was photographed with, or work where we knew that we were adding visual effects into it later on, so that it would service the plates. And the Empire Flex, it was a great camera, but as in most things like that, you build a prototype and you expect it to be your working camera, and you find out, well, yeah, it worked great when you were inside and it was 70 degrees, and you take it out in the Finsa winter with 10 to 20 below and wind and snow, and the electronics didn't quite work the way you thought they would work. It was like, what's wrong with the camera? It's not working. It's like, and even though they may have done a test or so, inside a meat locker or something, it's not, it's not quite the same as when you kind of get it out there on location. Things don't always work the same. Something, oh, I didn't know that would freeze up, because there were a lot of electronics and controls associated with it. But it turned out to be eventually a great camera. And then they were also building a new optical printer, which wasn't something that was being done. So we not only had the people who knew how to work the stuff, but we also had a manufacturing group of people who were building cameras and camera movements and working on lenses and building optical printers. And, it was really quite an operation.
Mm. At least, I guess, your cameo as Luke Skywalker for the Snowwalker piece, at least that was in the comfort of a studio.
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Shot against a green screen. It was pretty straightforward.
What was the extent of of those shots then? How much of you do we see in those shots, if you can remember?
Well, you only, I mean, I'm Luke. You can't really see that it's, it's like, oh, that's not Luke. Who is that? There were two sequences. One sequence was in the snow monster. I'm forgetting his name now. The Wampa. Thank you. In the Wampa cave. And the reason for that was, it's like kind of, brilliant. Mark got into a bad car accident between Star Wars and Empire. And we, George had to come up with a great story plan to show that this great looking California surfer kid, Mark was you look at Mark in Star Wars, he's a great looking young man, and you meet him in Empire and he completely mashed his face in, he didn't look, anything like it. If you go back and look at him, between Star Wars and Corvette Summer, which I also worked on, when he plays Kenny Dantley, poor Mark, his face is kind of all mauled up. They really did quite a job putting him back together again. So they had to explain, well, what happened to Luke, and so what happened to Luke is he gets caught by the Wampa, and the Wampa, takes his face off, and then it's really kind of, a great, like a spider, the Wampa sticks him in the snow to keep him fresh until he's ready to eat him. And so it's my hand that's reaching for the lightsaber because they needed a close-up of that they didn't have it. And so it's a reverse shot of the lightsaber jumping into my hand. It was the lightsaber being pulled out of my hand. And that was in one shot. And then the other shot was actually prior to that is Luke's hand reaching up to see how he could dislodge himself from his. But, and they did. Why did they use me? Because I'm athletic. I could hang upside down. Wasn't a problem for me. I was close to Mark's size. It was easy to put me into that outfit. I wanted to do it because I knew, from my years in the movie business that would be fun to say, oh yeah, that's me. As I used to joke later, my son was, in his, 10 to 14, it would buy me a lot of street cred amongst his friends and stuff to say, oh yeah, my dad was, Luke Skywalker. And I probably mentioned this before. And when he was much younger, like 4 or 5, he was off on this camping trip and backpacking. And the counselor said to him, so, what does your dad do? And he said, oh, my dad's Luke Skywalker. And he'd only seen, he'd seen very little of the movies. He was almost too young at that point. But Luke Skywalker, and the counselor ran over to my wife and said, are you married to Mark Hamill? She started laughing and said, no, no. My husband just photo doubled him, in a couple of shots. And then the one when I'm in the X-Wing fighter outfit was, I think it's, some shot of Luke throwing the bomb into the belly of the Snow Walker, or maybe getting lifted up. And again, it was easy because I was, athletic and I could hang. It was easy, easy to use me, and I was available. I didn't need to operate a camera. I
Hey,
didn't have,
there aren't many people who can say that they were Luke Skywalker, though. I guess it's you, Mark, and the
yeah,
stunt performer, really.
yeah, right, yeah, exactly, yeah, and the stunt performer. I'm trying to remember the stunt man's name. I've got his face is right here in my brain. He was,
I do
I
know,
love
isn't it?
stunt.
Colin Skeeping. Colin
Yes,
Skeeping.
exactly. It was
Yes.
Colin, right? Yeah, Colin, all his work. We did some funny things with Colin up in Norway, so pulled him up in a helicopter, stuff like, from the ground, and
Oh, yeah, to
some
go with those shots. Yeah, right.
couple of crazy things.
He was up
Yeah,
for it.
those stuntmen, they're up for anything.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
That's why they,
that's
that's
how
why
they
they
get paid, right?
exactly. That's right.
So
That's
those
right.
movies that were in the interim between Empire and Jedi, what was your role then throughout that period? You were looking after ILM. You were kind of heading that up, or
No,
you were.
I was done. After what happened was that I set up ILM, and then Gary wanted me to come to London and be with the production and go to Norway. And I hired a fellow named uh, Dick Gallagly, who I had worked with as a production manager when I was on the Streets of San Francisco TV show, because I thought it would be good to bring in a person with a production sensibility to kind of wrangle a visual effects unit together, because it was such this, disparate, set of disciplines all under one roof and so schedule dependent.
Mhm.
Because the way that the stuff floats through a facility is, roughly, you go from script and written word to storyboards, and from storyboards you start going off to the model shop, and then you've got to create the models and get them ready and get them on the stage and then photograph them and create the elements, and then you move that work to the optical department and the rotoscope department and the matte department afterwards to marry all of the elements together. So it's not that different than the way that visual effects movies are made now. You still have like a model shop, but they kind of model everything in, everything's all done in computers now. And the compositing department is now the optical department. And the animation department is you're still animating characters. And those characters are like the stop motion puppets that, it's why Phil Tippett's work has sort of moved from like Tauntauns and Snow Walkers and things of that nature to, creating characters
Mhm.
on screen, like, this stuff that when I worked there that we did for, The Matrix and Hellboy and, other movies and stuff. And that he did before I got there on Starship Troopers,
Mm.
all of those particular creatures, for that particular film. So, I thought, well, let's get Dick in here, and Dick's got a sensibility where he understands scheduling, because you can't get to F unless you do A, B, C, D, and E. It's that kind of a process. So Dick came in, and I went off to London, and when I came back from Norway, I was back in London for like a week, and Gary said, "I want you to go back home. I want you to go run ILM because we're having trouble back there." So I went, okay. So I went back again and left the UK because there wasn't necessarily a defined role for me at that point, although, I don't know if something would have developed or not. And went back to take over. And after I was there for a month or two, I had a better understanding and feeling for visual effects, because it's like a whole other master's degree in filmmaking that you pick up. And I had learned it over a few years. And Dick finally said, I'm not very happy here. You know, you take over. You're better at this than I am. I want to go back and go do live action again, which is what he used to. I think at that point in his career, I don't know. Anyway, he decided to go and I took over.
Mm-hmm.
And I became the general manager of ILM. And I stayed on through Empire. And then George wanted me to stay on beyond it. But at the time, I didn't want to run a visual effects facility because it's really hard work. And it's not only hard, it's like, hair pulling, you
Mm.
know, problem solving, all of this stuff. And I kind of missed certain live action stuff. And I also missed a certain element of the filmmaking,
Mm.
being on the set and working with the actors and all of that kind of work as opposed to just post production visual effects. And so the chore became, let's find somebody to come in here and be an ongoing general manager. And I brought in a fellow to interview who I had, again, worked with many years earlier when I was an assistant cameraman. He was a documentarian, but I thought he had a good sensibility to learn this craft. And his name was Tom Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom came in and Tom took over. And so when Empire was over, Tom was done because I was going to take a little time off because I was completely burnt out. After, I had started, I was probably next to George, the first employee on the Empire, and Gary, the first employee on Empire. I came on to Empire in January of 1978, and Empire didn't come out until 2 years later. So I came on before anybody did. It was like employee number one, not if you don't count the guys who had been on the sequel. And after me, and then it was Joe Johnston, and then everybody, up to 300 people or whatever the number would be from that point. And I was kind of, hadn't really had much time off in a couple of years. I did squeak a week off at one point, but anyway, so I said I need to get out of here. And they were immediately going to start on Raiders and start on Dragon Slayer. And they were doing Dragon Slayer because Matthew Robbins was the writer director, and his partner producer Hal Barwood, also writer, lived in the Bay Area, and they wanted to do the post production. And Paramount was doing Raiders, and Paramount was doing Dragon Slayer, and it was a very natural fit to go do that movie. And because Matthew and Hal had been around when we were shooting Empire, they had gained this visual facility of what you could do with visual effects and how great it would look for dragons. And now people say they're re-releasing Dragon Slayer because dragons are very popular these days with Game of Thrones and Home of, House of Dragons or whatever the new sequel is. And so Dragon Slayer was next, and then they did Raiders right after that. And then I went to work, right away, again, like early 1981 on what was Revenge of the Jedi initially. And then, again with Jedi, it was like, 12 to 14 months of prep before we started shooting. I guess production started I forget when production started in London. But the breakdown on Jedi was, again, I was responsible for everything in the US, and Robert was responsible for everything in the UK. And this time, what we decided to do is, rather than going back to Tunisia, we decided to find those desert locations here in the US. So we had two big locations to accommodate. And, one was the desert and the other was, the woods, the sand in the woods. And we spent time scouting locations, early on. That was really one of the first chores. We got a script early on, just as Raiders was finishing, from George, and Gary had left and Howard Gazanjian had come in to be the producer. And, I remember the early days on Jedi were Robert and me and Norman Reynolds traveling around the Western United States on, what the Brits would call a recce and the US would call a location scout, to try and find the locations for the desert. And the desert they were both tough locations. But we knew, trees. It's okay. We want to shoot in the redwoods, so we're going to find something in California where the redwoods are, which is like from Santa Cruz to the Oregon border. That's where the redwoods are. And the difficulty of that was finding private redwood property because to go, most of the redwoods that you went, it was during the Save the Redwoods time in California and in the U.S. And so a lot of the beautiful old trees were being designated as park property, and which meant that they didn't want you coming in putting explosions in the trees, and screwing the trees up, or coming in with a movie company comes in with vehicles and all-terrain vehicles, and they dig stuff up and they build sets, and nobody wanted to do that, in the middle of beautiful parkland in Muir Woods or Humboldt State Park or any of these either national or state parks. It was like, no, forget it. We don't want you. You're really not welcome. Or not that we don't want you. We said, well, you can't do what you want to do. So it took us a long time to find some private property to go work on, and eventually we did up outside of Smith River at a private logging place. The woman who was in charge of the redwood locations is a woman named Mickey Herman, who I had worked with on Empire as a production coordinator. And I said, Mickey, I took the two locations and I gave them to two people. Mickey got the redwoods, and another production guy named Lewis Friedman got the desert. And Mickey, I think that Mickey knew every acre of redwoods from Santa Cruz to Oregon by helicopter. She knew where everything was. And eventually we found a local guy up in Smith River who knew the folks at Millerillum, and they had this curtain of redwoods that was probably about a half-mile wide that sort of went from close to where Highway 101 was, which is that main road that runs up the coast of California, from LA all the way up into Oregon. That was a curtain because you could see these beautiful redwoods, and on the other side of it was clear cut. And they left it there so that as you were driving up, that you couldn't see what they were doing on the other side of it, which was decimating and cutting down all of these, prehistoric redwood trees, the trees that had been there, I think, for 1,000 years, or maybe maybe 400 years, 500 years, and it was one of the most amazing experiences that I ever had, was going there for the first time and walking down into this forest that hadn't been trailed, like it was in the national parks or state parks and stuff, but like to sort of be in this woods and to sink into fern floors where your foot would sink down a foot, and you knew that you were like standing maybe where people had never stood before.
Wow.
These, decades and generations of these old trees. And it was just, and these trees were absolutely magnificent, just absolutely beautiful. And that's where we found our location. They gave us permission to go shoot there because they had eventually plans to cut them all down. And, they didn't care if we, put a explosive squib in the bark of a tree or something, or built a little road down into the forest to build our sets or stuff like that, or, created, our, places for the Ewoks, or did our gags and stunts. And so anyway, we're there. And then the other part of it was to go sort of remodel Tunisia, to go find Tatooine. And we finally found it. It wasn't so much to find as Jabba's palace, but to find the location for Jabba's barge. And there we needed an expanse of desert. Again, it's like Norway, no trees, no vegetation. So we found it just by the border in Buttercup Valley between Arizona and California, just outside of Yuma. And again, the thing with these locations is that it's not just finding a great location, but it's also because of the Star Wars movie, and you're doing lots of gags and stuff. And for that location, we built a set. It was the largest exterior set that had ever been built, I understand, in the history of motion picture making. The Jabba's barge and that set and the sand dune that we built and the barge that we built, it was huge, just huge. I mean, you would never do that now. It would all be done with miniatures and matte paintings.
Yeah.
But then we didn't want to do it because we had too much stuff going on, with, people on the barge and people on the little barge and, the skiffs that were flowing around and people jumping into the Sarlacc pit and going in between the two of them. And it was, quick story was, meeting sailors who would help us design Jabba's barge. And, so one of the first meetings being, we had a guy whose name was the Commodore, who was still alive. I heard the other day, guys like in his late 80s or 90s, and he was this great sailor and sailboat designer. And in one of the first meetings is, so you want to build a sailboat in the middle of the desert that doesn't move. And that was really one of the challenges, is you're putting sails up with possible wind problems, but you don't want the boat to move because you can't move because it's locked into this, this incredibly huge structure. It was, quite remarkable. Anyway, so it took a really long time to build that particular set. The other issue that was particularly difficult for me on Jedi, and this is again from like a production point of view, is that George didn't want to become an LA signator to the union, the IATSE, because he was a San Francisco-based company. So he wanted to run everything through the San Francisco local, which was Local 16, which created limitations on the people who we could hire to go to Yuma and to go to Smith River to build these locations and build these sets, because the Local 16 union was not only a movie union of limited scope because they don't make or didn't make a lot of movies in San Francisco. Back in the 80s, okay, well, what were they making in San Francisco? Not too many movies. Clint Eastwood would come up and he would shoot the Dirty Harry stuff, and Streets of San Francisco that I worked on shot that. And, there was American Graffiti in the conversation. And most of the time, the pictures that came to San Francisco weren't San Francisco based movies, but they were LA based movies. And they would bring all their crew with them, right, and they'd hire on a few extra grips and electricians and prop guys, whatever they needed. But we were staffing a whole picture to do a major movie, out of, this limited resource. And so it created problems in the people that we had to hire. So we were constantly like making deals with different locals in LA, like the camera local, the construction local, a special effects local, that we could hire key people and they could bring one or two, key assistants, and then other people would have to be staffed from underneath. So it like wasn't the best way to make a major motion picture. But, that was the mandate. And, that was sort of, what we did. There was another reason behind it, too, is that because when you worked with the LA locals, they were the motion picture locals. They had all negotiated residual payments if the picture did well. And San Francisco hadn't done that yet. And Lucasfilm wanted to save money.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to have to pay residual payments and profit participations out to the LA locals. So that was another reason why we worked with the San Francisco local, because that wasn't something that they had done yet. And so in retrospect, it probably saved, millions of dollars. If not, looking back on it now, I kind of like, I don't know, such as life.
You did what was needed at the time, right? So, but
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, when did it become apparent that Return of the Jedi was not to be the third of 12 movies, but there'd be a long pause? When was that decision made? Do you think? Do you remember?
I think it was probably made when George and Marcia got divorced.
Sure.
I think that was the key. Because it happened. Their separation, I think, was happening during the post-production period of Jedi. It became apparent to me that something was off in Camelot, in, spring of '83, and then it all sort of came to, that they were separating and divorcing, I think in the latter part of '83, but, knowing everybody, all the people involved, I kind of got a hit of something's not right here. back in, April, May, March of 83, right around that period, and then I think they separated and divorced in later 83 after Jedi came out. And I think that after that, that, Lucasfilm, took a turn and that there weren't going to be any other Star Wars movies for some period. And I think some of that, there were financial reasons for that,
Mm,
that may have had to do with, I don't know, legal stuff, but I don't know what any of those details are.
sure.
Either that or George was like, I'm done with Star Wars for a while. I'm going to
Yeah.
go do some other stuff. It's like, forget it. So he did, what they do. They did I left Jedi after production was over, sort of July. We finished shooting like in May, June or something. And I think in early July, I left because I was approached by Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood to go do this picture called The Grid that I need.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't figure out how to do it, but I need to show you those production illustrations that Sid Mead and Ralph McQuarrie had all created for this great time travel movie. They're really quite beautiful, and maybe we'll make that, part three or something. We can talk about other movies or talk about that one or something. But but they were really great stuff. So I left because they wanted me to produce that, and rather than staying on in post production, I went to George and went to Howard and said, well, you got, Tom's running ILM and you're here running post production, and you've got Mickey and Lewis, and there's not a whole lot to do. And these guys want me to go produce a big movie. So you mind if I take off? And George said, if it's okay with Howard, it's okay with me. And Howard said, sure, if you want to, go for it. And so I kind of left, sort of what like Robert had done over the years, that when production was finished, he had left to go, produce a Raiders movies or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they then went on, and I think the next thing they did was a TV movie the next year, and then they did Howard the Duck. And I was, in retrospect, I was kind of happy not to be around for those. Howard the Duck was a mistake. And then they did that, and then I'm trying to think of all the movies that George had made between that and the next group. But it was many years until he did the next Star Wars.
Yeah. Were you quite surprised that kind of came about, that he revisited it?
No, I wasn't. I always thought that he would eventually go back to it, and he went back to it with him directing, you know, and working on the screenplays, and you know, and he hired the company had changed at that point, and they hired a whole new group of people, and I don't think that any of the production people who had worked on the originals came back to work on it.
Mm.
And we can talk about that off camera sometime if you want.
Talking about George coming back to directing, of course, with Empire, he had Irvin Kershner. With Return of the Jedi, had Richard Marquand. We've always heard these kind of gossip and rumours that George, was using Richard as a puppet and all of this kind of stuff. Now, don't feel under any pressure to answer this, Jim, but
I don't. No, I don't. I wouldn't say that that's true at all. I think
so. You felt that Richard had full command of everything there, within the remit of what George had given.
Yes, yeah, I do. I think that it took a while to find Richard, and I remember being in a screening room watching Eye of the Needle, and George being very impressed with that film, everything about it, and sort of saying at the time, I want to meet this guy. Let's talk to him. I think he's got the chops to do this picture. Because he knew. They also wanted to hire a Brit because George was not affiliated with the Directors Guild because he had problems with the DGA. So he kind of resigned from as a Directors Guild member. So he couldn't hire an American to direct the movie.
Mm.
Whereas on Empire, he could, but then after Empire, Lucasfilm and DGA had a falling out, and George resigned, and so the next picture had to be done with someone who wasn't a DGA member, and that's why we went looking for British directors. So I mean, every director has a different sensibility and personality, and who they are and how they work with people. And so Kirshner is a was a very well established director with a specific point of view and vision for what he wanted out of the movie. And his strength was working with the actors. The acting in Empire is better than in any of the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationships that you see, between Han and Leia and Luke are the best. And even C-3PO and Chewie and R2D, all of that stuff. It's everything there it's a better. I think Empire is my favorite film. I think it's also the most interesting. It's got some of the most dynamic to it. It's the middle movie, so you're not like ending up, you're ending down to get you to the film. And Kirsch is a great guy. He's just a great director and a wonderful director. And so when you go to do Jedi, I think that Richard wasn't the experienced director that Kirsch was going into it. And Richard had only directed a few movies and a bunch of television. And Richard was being dropped, Kirsch was coming in to do the first sequel. So let's hope we're going to be successful. And then, you got Star Wars, then you got Empire, and then you go to Jedi, and it's the third one. And Richard's being dumped into a machine that has now sort of become a little bit more well-oiled and had a direction and had a path and had all these people who knew what they were doing, what their skill sets and responsibilities were. So I think that he was a little bit more awestruck than Kirsch was in this whole process. And because of that, I think he sort of knew that these are George's movies. This is Lucasfilm. It's George, and this is Star Wars. And so if something would come up, he would run it by George. He would talk to George about it. If the visual effects said, no, it's hard to do that, but we could do this or do that. He wasn't there to rock a boat. He was there to go make a movie, which is what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And in any production, there are times that people might disagree about stuff like that. And I don't think that, I wouldn't call Richard a puppet. I don't think he was hired. He was hired to go direct a movie, and that's what he did. And I don't know if I would agree with that particular opinion. I enjoyed working with Richard.
Good.
I think it's a tough job to step into, and then I think that he did a really good job to, carry it off. And Jedi was also a very different screenplay. It's not my favorite of the movies. I have,
yeah, reservations. I'm glad you said that about Richard, because I think, it's one of those things that has become part of Star Wars lore, that Richard was just kind of there because the film had kind of run away from Kirsch and Gary Kurtz a little bit in terms of budget and schedule and things like that. And it was, I think people just put 2 and 2 together and come up with 5 with Richard. So I'm glad you've said that, because unfortunately, of course, Richard passed away young and has never had the benefit of talking about that experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, really very sad though. Because he was a very talented guy and had a good career ahead of him as well.
Yeah.
After this.
Yeah, it's worth checking out, Eye of the Needle, isn't it? I watched it some years ago, and it is, I think maybe what George saw in it is the kind of the efficiency he had in moving the story along.
Yes.
There's nothing loose. There are no loose ends in that movie. Everything progresses the story. Yeah. What then? Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I didn't hear what you said then. Sorry.
I was going to try to talk for a second about Empire getting away with Kirsch and with Gary and stuff. And Kirsch is a director with a lot of vision, and he knew what he wanted, and what he tried to do. And they were, Empire, they did a lot of new stuff on Empire. I mean, as a movie, photographically, and what they did with the picture, and it was a tough picture. to go out and do all this and kind of pull it off. Yeah, and they did go over budget, and it was a big problem. And I think a lot of, in retrospect is I wasn't close to that because I was back at ILM, and ILM that was my mandate, and I'm happy to say that ILM was we were we were moving along. We were doing what we needed to do, and I wasn't in the UK, and I don't know why the communication didn't got, and maybe it has to do with Gary's personality and Kirsch's personality and everything else. But anyway, it got fucked up, and it was a problem. Did you talk to Robert about that? What did Robert have to say?
Robert didn't really go into kind of any detail about that. He kept things fairly high energy and fairly jolly when I spoke to Robert. But he acknowledged that of course there were problems, and in retrospect you look back at Empire and those things you've just said about it exactly, is that thank goodness all of that happened, because we wouldn't have the movie that we have today, that we all still look back on fondly and still holds up as not only the best Star Wars movie, but one of the best movies ever made. It's forever, at the top of polls of the best 100 movies or whatever. So,
Right.
had it gone the way that George may have wanted it to go, maybe we wouldn't have had the movie that we've got now. So, I think maybe Robert looks back, not with rose-tinted spectacles, but kind of just with an appreciation of what came out the other side of all of that conflict and all of that difficulty and the overrun and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, it's problematic.
Um, when you finished on Jedi, then what was next in store for you, and what were your intentions leaving a big production like that? What did you want to do next? Where was your next kind of rung in the ladder?
Well, I was excited to sort of go off and be the producer on this other movie with Barwood and
Yeah.
Robbins, this time travel movie, The
Mm.
Grid. That what was next for me, and that was very exciting. And it was exciting because it was a big movie. I was the only producer. I was working, with two writers who I respect immensely, who had written a really good script. And we were trying to do some new and different things that hadn't been done before. And I was working with some, Ralph McQuarrie and Sid Mead, who I had brought in, and all of the things that I had learned on Empire and Jedi, and over the years, I was hoping to to put to use, and make a great picture. And plus, I was home. I wasn't in LA. Matthew and Hal both lived up here. We were setting up a production, and I put together what I thought was a really good plan to go off and make this picture. I was still young, and it was very exciting. It was a great time.
And when it didn't come off, how do you move on? How do you put that behind you? It must be something very difficult to do.
It's impossible to do. I mean, I still haven't put it behind me. You can hear from my enthusiasm
Yeah,
talking about it. How if you were a studio executive, I would pitch it to them the way I pitched it to you last time
yeah,
we spoke. It's like, with all that spirit and enthusiasm about what a great picture it would have been.
yeah.
But that's showbiz.
Yes.
That's just the way it goes. You think of how many great movies there are that you think are going to be great. You never know. That have never, didn't get made for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I worked on The Grid for from 82 through 83 into in late 83 we kind of realized that maybe it wasn't happening.
Mm.
And while I was doing The Grid, Hal was the executive producer, but Hal was off writing another movie that was called originally called Biohazard. That was then Hal came to me and said, "Well, it doesn't look like we're going to make this, but I want you to come produce, Biohazard for me. And I think we've got a deal at Fox. So why don't you come on board and be my producer?" So it was like, great, I'd love to, because I like these guys. I liked Hal. I thought he'd never directed before. I thought he would be a good director. And we went off and we made, what was Biohazard. But, right before we went into production, some low budget, company released a movie called Biohazard. So we couldn't use the title. So we went looking for a new title, and we settled on the title of Warning Sign,
Mm-hmm.
which in retrospect was not a good title. If somebody would have said you should have named them, you would have been better naming the movie "Don't Open That Door," you know, because it was a horror thriller, you know, and you know, it's like, don't go down that hallway. It's like, it would have been better just to set it up like, don't do that. You know, it's like, you know, why not? You know, that's that kind of a title, but we wound up calling it Warning Sign because we wanted to take advantage of what then was a new symbol, but now you see all the time, which is the biohazard symbol. Mm. Those three, you know, three circles together with lines, which is like biohazard. And anyway, so we pushed that in the advertising, and then the one sheet poster and the trailer was all about the warning symbols and stuff. And anyway, we went out and made that movie. And the story of that movie, you know, it's like, you know, life in Hollywood are full of stories. We were greenlit by one studio president, and in the middle of production, he was fired. And another president came in, and then another president came in over him, another chairman. So what happened? There was a guy whose name was Larry. I'm going to forget all these names now. I forget. Joe Wazan was the first president who greenlit the movie, and we got it going, and we were shooting in Los Angeles, and we had to cast the picture, and we cast with Sam. I give you shall I give you a quick pitch on the story?
Sure.
There's a gene splicing lab in a small town in Utah. And the local community thinks that they're involved in agrogenetics, making corn grow faster, better, yielding more proteins and, you know, good food qualities. But they find out that they're not involved with agrogenetics. They're dealing with germ warfare. But nobody knows about it, except a couple of the scientists who are working down in the secret, you know, highly contained P4 level. And there's an accident, and the virus gets out, and people start getting sick, and they have to close the facility down, and they have to call the government in. And the government decides to seal the place off and let the disease. This is the COVID story.
Yeah.
The government says, nobody in, nobody out. We're going to let it run its course, and we're going to let everybody who's there die, because we have no antidote. And what they were developing, you know, this is all fictional stuff, but it's stuff that was going on we made this in 1984, 1985. This is 35 years before the pandemic. And you remember all the Wuhan stuff? Oh, they were in a laboratory and there was an accident in the lab. This is what Warning Sign was about. So they closed the facility down, and the government says, we've had an accident. And, you know, the government's lying to the local people. We've had an accident, and you can't get in to get your loved ones, and they can't come out because we can't risk that the virus is going to get out and completely ruin all of the crops, you know, not only in your neighborhood, but for the entire state. And they're just lying. And people start to like, what's going on? What's going on? Let's go back to the human side of the story. So the human side of the story is that there's a local sheriff played by Sam Waterston. Okay. And his wife, who was the local security guard in the laboratory, played by Kathleen Quinlan. And there's a disaffected biologist who used to work on this virus, but got out because he realized that this was bad stuff. And that was played by Jeffrey DeMunn. And the government guy is played by Yaphet Kotto. Okay. You know Yaphet from Alien?
Yeah.
Okay. Yaphet plays the government guy who has to come in and you know, close everything down. And there's an accident, and the sheriff has to keep everybody out, and the sheriff wants to know what's going on, but he can't reach anybody inside. But he finally gets a call from his wife, Joni, Kathleen. What's going on? I don't know. They instituted the protocol, and we had to lock the place down, and it's really scary, and people are upset. And, you know, Cal, what's going on the outside? And they said there was an accident down in the P4 level. And she says, P4? Oh, that's where the most serious stuff goes on. So the virus they developed, you know, I wish the movies were as exciting sometimes as the pitch. The virus that they developed was that they gene spliced a virus that would infect the rhinencephalon, which is the rage center of the brain. They were giving everybody a form of rabies, where if you got infected, you would get sick, like COVID sick, but you'd pass out. It was a zombie movie, but you'd wake up. And when you woke up, as a weapon of war, rather than you having to kill your enemy, they would kill each other. So loved ones would turn against loved ones, allies, you'd wake up and you would get kind of rabid, but lucid. It was like a lucid rabidity. You would like trick people into doing stuff, and then you would attack them and kill them. And then eventually, a little while later, you would die, but you would pass the virus on to whoever else had it. So eventually, everybody just kills each other, and everybody dies off. Problem was that they never developed an antidote for it that was effective, And so there's an accident in the lab, and they make some great discovery, and some guy knocks it off the table while they're taking a picture, and another doctor steps on it, and it breaks. And all of a sudden, people start getting sick. They get sick because there's one guy who's the manager of the laboratory who forgets to take his contact out when he goes into the disinfectant shower, and he leaves it in. And he's the typhoid Mary who spreads it to everybody in the whole facility. And Joni realizes that something's going on when the people start acting crazy and they come after her. You should you should watch this movie, Jamie.
Well, I was just going to say, where was this in summer 2021? It would have been a hit again.
So so what happened was that Fox made the movie. Fox got bought by Disney. Disney wasn't interested in releasing it again as a Disney movie, but they had a deal with Hulu. Hulu wasn't interested. They didn't know what to do with it. People looked at it, and people didn't like it. They thought it was, it's like it's a B horror movie. Anyway, Hal and I used to, argue with each other. I thought it would have been better had it been more psychological. When people started to get sick, that you didn't know they were sick. Are they sick? Are they not sick? What are you not? You're not quite sure. You set up a little tension. But Hal wanted to do stuff with makeup. So when people got sick, he started putting like boils on their face. Say, oh, this person's sick because you can see something's going on. And anyway, it's kind of, it's a bit of a horror film. It's a horror thriller.
I'm going to try and find it.
It's like it's really one of the early zombie movies, people, what was the first zombie movie? Dawn of the Day of the Dead?
Night of the Living Dead, I guess it was.
Thank you. Night of the Living Dead. The Night of the Living Dead had already been made. So, somebody had done a zombie movie before that. And so this was kind of, borderline psychological thriller, zombie movie, horror movie, all these things. And so the story then becomes, Joni's on the inside, Kathleen Quinn, and Sam Waterston's on the outside. He wants to go in and get his wife out and rescue her and rescue all the people. Yaphet Kotto's lying through his teeth. The people on the outside are trying to break in. They're bringing the Marines in to, quarantine the place. And the tensions are mounting inside, outside, all around. And then eventually Waterston goes and finds the disaffected biologist who worked on it, and he meets the guy and he says, I need your help. And the biologist says, I knew you'd come calling for me eventually. It's a great scene. And Damon is a really good actor. If you see him, you'll recognize him.
Yeah.
And he's also become an alcoholic at that point. And so Sam's got to get him back down and figure out how to get him into the facility, because they don't know why that Joni hasn't gotten sick. She's the only one why isn't she sick? And they're trying to figure it out because everybody else is sick and they're all killing each other. But Joni's locked up and she's not sick. And as it turns out, she's pregnant. So it's the life force that keeps her alive, and it's keeping her immune system working, to protect the baby. You get the hit.
This sounds like it belongs on Shudder or somewhere like that. These horror streaming,
platform. They who was it who did it? One of the DVD companies did a Blu-ray version and re-released it, and interviewed Hal and interviewed me in front of and it's good. So I would say, if you have a DVD at home,
you
should get it from them if you can, or buy it off of Amazon.
Yeah, I'll try and do that.
And watch. So let me go back to where I started the story, which is typical of my storytelling. I start over here and I go 20 places and I'll try to tie back in. So we were greenlit by Joe Wazan. Joe was fired. Larry Gordon, who was a producer, came in as the new president of the studio. And Larry's opinion was, look, you're greenlit. You start shooting in 2 weeks. I'm not going to shut you down. You're a cheap movie. You're only $6 or $7 million. You're shooting locally. It could be okay. So go make your movie. And so I specifically wanted to get away from the studio. So we went out and found a high school that had been closed down to shoot in, because high schools are great locations for interior movies, because you've got everything you need in a high school. You've got all these classrooms you can turn into sets. You've got auditoriums, you've got a cafeteria for feeding people. You've got like machine shops and car shops and, all of these shops. Yeah, all the locations that, you've got a gym that you can shoot in with high ceilings for hanging lights and buildings. It was ideal. We went in and we built a lab in La Crescenta at the, some high school or junior high school up there. And it was just far enough from the studio that it was like, that I could hear the studio executive saying, "Oh, you want to go visit the guys working on Warning Sign?" It's like, "Where are they?" It's like, "Well, they're in La Crescenta." "Oh, it'll take forever to get there. Forget it. We'll spend a whole afternoon going up and back." So they never came to visit us. They just left us, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to be left alone. And so we went up to La Crescenta, and I think we did the location work first in Utah, which went very well. We just went into an empty warehouse because it was all exterior. It was all the exterior stuff, and we did daytime shooting and nighttime shooting and whatnot, all the Yaphet Kotto stuff, and it all went very well. And then came back, and so we got to finish the picture. And then after we were done shooting and we were in post-production, as we were getting closer to release, Barry Diller was hired to run Fox. And so what happens when you're a movie at a studio? You become a bastard child.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants you. The guy who greenlit you is gone. So he's out of here. The new guy who comes in, and his new bosses, which was interesting at the time. It was Barry Diller, Larry Marks, and Scott Rudin came in to run the facility. But Larry was still the president of the facility, but these other guys were doing, sort of the future stuff at Fox. And, all who were big heavyweights, later, and then in the entertainment business. Diller used to run Paramount. Larry was producer. Scott Rudin became a very big producer. And I'll tell you a funny story in a minute. They came in to run, so we became a liability, and nobody wanted, it was like, if you fail when you're released, it's like, not my movie. I didn't green light it. It's like,
Right.
we just let it go. And if it did well, fine. If it didn't, next, what's next? So they didn't help us release the picture. They didn't do anything. So we had like an $800,000 marketing budget, which is not, nothing. Even in 1985, when the picture came out, they gave us a release date of August 5th, 1985, which back then it was known as the dog days of August. Who releases a movie on August 5th when it's the height of summertime, everybody's on vacation, no money to publicize the movie, just put it out in, 100 theaters or something and see how it does. Well, it did. But people who have seen it like it. People say, "Oh, it's good." Hal did a really good job. It's a roller coaster ride from start to finish. It's just a bang, bang. In the movie, it just runs like a Spielberg movie. You turn it on, and off you go. You're on an e-ticket ride at Disneyland, and it just takes you from start to finish all the way through. There's it doesn't slow down, it doesn't stop. It just it goes from the very beginning. And in retrospect, I enjoy watching it. Other people said, "Oh yeah, it's a really good B movie, and it did okay, and blah blah blah." Anyway, you should watch it. So we should have got dumped on, is what happened. And I really tried to. So I'll tell you two stories. Before we released the picture, I was trying to go out, and the marketing people, they weren't putting any money into marketing. So I tried to do what I could to generate some publicity. And I knew Richard Schickel, who was the movie reviewer from Time Magazine, from the work that he had did on Empire and Jedi. And I called Richard up and I said, Richard, would you go watch this movie, please? Because I think it's really good. And he wrote a good review in Time Magazine, but nothing caught because of the time of year and stuff. And it was just one good review. But Richard liked the movie and he was very complimentary. And the other thing I did in making the movie was that Hal was a first-time director. So I went out of my way to surround Hal with really good technicians to help him make the movie. So we hired Dean Cundy, who was the director of photography on all the Back to the Future movies. I hired Henry Bumstead as a production designer who had worked on many of the Alfred Hitchcock and George Roy Hill movies. I hired an editor named Robert Lawrence. Okay. I mean, Hal was all part of this, but I wanted to make sure that we had all these great people around him. And a guy named Robert Lawrence, who was the editor on Spartacus with Stanley Kubrick. It was this great, and we hired a sound designer because I knew how important sound was from having worked on The Conversation and the Star Wars movies, and a guy named Alan Splett, who had worked on Amadeus. And Alan came in and designed this brilliant soundtrack so that when you're inside the building, there's like stuff creaking, so if you watch the movie, crank up the volume so you can hear the sound design, because I knew how important sound is as an added element to filmmaking. And Alan did this just beautiful job of sound design. And, technically speaking, it's for the money that we had. And Aggie Rogers was our costume designer, and I'd worked with Aggie on Graffiti and The Conversation and Return of the Jedi. And, she's, an award-winning costume designer and, a good friend of mine. There were all these really good people around. Yeah. So
all the elements were there, right?
Huh?
All of the elements were there.
Try to bring all the elements together to make the best thing possible. So the other quick story. So I went to Washington, D.C. to see if I could generate some publicity for the movie, because it was about gene splicing, and gene splicing was becoming a very hot topic in the news. And I did a screening, and with a guy whose name was, he became one of the leading anti-genetic engineering, agrogenetics advocates. And I'm forgetting his name right now, but he became very famous in the years after Warning Sign came out. But I hired him to help put a screening together. And we invited a lot of press people from, the National Public Radio and science writers and stuff like that to come watch the movie. And when we made the movie, some guys from Monsanto showed up. Monsanto is the big agriculture company. I don't know if they're around anymore. I think they're probably Archer Daniels or somebody now. They were probably bought out, but they were doing all of the early corn genetic engineering, and they were worried that if this, and it was really funny, they were worried that if the picture became popular, that it was going to reflect really badly on their work and their business. And these four guys showed up in black suits, black ties, white shirts. It was like the Men in Black came to the screening, and these are the guys from Monsanto. And I was like, oh, you guys are here to see the movie. And I knew immediately what they were scared. They were scared that this was going to hurt their business, because we weren't talking about corn. We were talking about germ warfare. And I think there had been an accident a year or two before, earlier at Fort Detrick in Maryland, where they were actually working on this stuff, that some anthrax got out, and it was a big problem. And anyway, germ warfare is a really serious problem. You even hear Biden say now, when he talks about Russia, no nuclear weapons, no chemical, no biological, and this is the early days of biological warfare. So anyway, the picture released, it went nowhere, and now I get to wax on.
I must admit, your pitch is still very good. You've made me want to see this movie now. Have you ever been approached to write a book about your time in the industry, or have you ever thought about doing it yourself?
I've thought about it, but I've just thought about it. I think it would probably be more fun to sit down with somebody like you and just talk and talk and talk and talk, and then transcribe it, and then take that and figure out a way to turn it into something. That would be the way to.
That would definitely be the way to do it, I think. Yeah.
Because I kind of get excited and I start going, and when I'm by myself and I'm just talking and rambling, I don't have that. Yeah. The things are not. bouncing off the my wall like a pinball machine,
And
which they
as a last question then, Jim, because where are we now? We're 11:30, blimey. Um, as a last question then, do you other than talking to people like me on occasions, do you give yourself the chance to kind of look back and admire the work that you did, and really kind of let it soak in?
well, not not really. I don't think that the only thing that I that's different is that I know a lot of people who work as hard or harder than I ever did. And I think that somehow when my, I was talking when my pinball got dropped in the machine, I just got really lucky, early on to, work with some good people. That's all. And, I think that's kind of it. And what I kind of get excited about, the work and the storytelling and the movie making and, the process and I mean, you can sort of hear me. I hope that's what sort of comes out when I talk.
Definitely.
But the other stuff, it's not. I don't get any pats on the back, because it's the movie business is like this. You're up, you're down. You're up, you're down. You're up, you're down, down. You're up, and it's like good luck. If you no, I try not to do that because that's hubris. And it comes back and bites you in the ass. And it's not worth it because I know so many people who work so hard, and do such good work. And you work as hard on the shitty movies as you do in the good ones, And if you get lucky, it's a good movie. And if you don't, it's a shitty movie, And it's, the nature of the movie business is what have you done for me lately? And, what was the last thing you made? And every time you finish something, you're doing something else again. I mean, the Robert used to have this expression that working on movies is an apprenticeship for life. You're always learning something new every time you do something different. It's always completely different. So, always something new to learn. Something like, oh, I wish I would have known that then. Like some of the stories I told you before about with Steven shaking the board. Why
Yeah.
I did that. Why didn't I do that when we make the grid? Well, I didn't. So, that movie never got made for one reason or another. So, maybe it's just my memory of the stories. But no, I try not to, I just got lucky. I worked with some great people. I'm really happy that I got to work with these guys because they were really great directors. I mean, not just the directors, but they were the directors and the production designers, and the cameramen and everybody, the editors, the sound designers, everybody who got to contribute on all these movies. It's really a collaborative. It's a collaborative art. There's no doubt about it. And people who think, oh no, it's just the director. It's like, yeah, good fucking luck. It's not. It's everybody who contributes to the process. And and it's also stuff that took me years to sort of learn, particularly in managing people. Is that you're only as good as the people who come through the door. And if the people who come through the door aren't good, your final product's not going to be good because those people don't care. And then the other thing is that it's important to, be good to everybody, to treat people well. So many people I met in the movie business who were, nice up and shitty down, if you know what I mean. They're nice to the people whose ass they have to kiss, and all the people who are underneath them, they treat them like shit. And it's like, fuck you. I mean, it's not only not a bad business practice, it's bad humanity. It's not how you be human.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Jim Bloom. Thanks, Jim. Really appreciated your time and really enjoyed chatting to you. We may even be going to visit Jim in relation to our Joe Alves documentary because Joe and Jim worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So next up is VFX legend, yes, legend, namely Dennis Muren. I had a wonderful conversation with Dennis just a couple of weeks ago. We chatted for over an hour about his incredible career. You're going to love it. I loved it. So that'll be episode 63 in late November 2022. I've also just set a date with Rose Dugnan, she of ILM. If you watched Light and Magic on Disney Plus, you'll have seen Rose talking about her time at the world-beating effects house. It'll be great to get her unique perspective as a long-term staffer and production supervisor. With these big documentary series, people don't always get to talk at length about their careers. This is what this podcast is about. So I'm looking forward to hearing more of that fleshed out by Rose. That will be the first episode of December 2022. Wow, we're there already. Remember to join me on Twitter, if it's still running, at JamieSWB, on Instagram and Facebook as Filmumentaries, and do check out our Kickstarter trailer for the Joe Alves doc. Your support will mean the world to us. We really have put our heart and soul into this so far, and with your help we know we can make an outstanding documentary and get it out to you. I'm so looking forward to it. I think you can hear in my voice I'm not a particularly demonstrative person, but I'm quite emotional about this because we feel a real need to get these stories out there, and we feel we need to honour Joe and honour his career and his lovely family that welcomed us in back in March earlier this year. So fingers crossed, and do support us in any way you can. Retweeting, reposting, telling your friends, anybody you know that loves Jaws, Close Encounters, Escape from New York, production design, behind the scenes, DVD extras, anything like that. Just tell them, get it to them somehow. We're going to be spending a lot of time on social media in the next few weeks, and I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
You're going to go down there in that cage and kill that shark.